Hello Saints, welcome in for another midweek video. Today we're going to take a brief look at Isaiah chapter 59, not the entire chapter. As a matter of fact, I really just want to hone in on one verse. The beginning of that chapter goes this way. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that he cannot save, nor his ear heavy, that it cannot hear. That's a good lesson for us. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. Your hands are defiled with blood, your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies, your tongue has muttered perversity. That's a bad situation. That's an indictment that none of us want to hear. He goes on in verse 9 to say, therefore justice is far from us, nor does righteousness overtake us. We look for light, and there is darkness for brightness. We walk in darkness. And it goes on, that continues an indictment. You can read it. He says, and the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his own arm brought salvation for him, and his own righteousness sustained him. This sounds familiar. He put on a righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on the garments of vengeance for clothing and was clad with zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, accordingly he will repay fury to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. The coastlands will fully repay. It's a bad situation. It's a bad indictment on God's people, and also an indictment on anyone who would be adversaries or enemies of God. And then the verse that I wanted to really hone in on is verse 19. So shall they fear, again, adversaries, enemies. So shall they fear the name of the Lord from the west, and the glory from the rising of the sun. So it doesn't take much of a geography lesson to realize that they're going to fear the name of the Lord from the west, the glory from the rising of the sun, which is in the east. And so that covers pretty much all the ground, that they will fear the Lord in a healthy way. And then it says this, when the enemy comes in like a flood. There are varying positions on this phrase, on this verse. But I'm reading from the New King James, and that's what we're using today. When the enemy comes in like a flood. Now, God's enemy becomes our enemy, and our enemy is God's enemy. You do have an adversary. You and I do have an enemy. Now, the enemy is not those people that you're mad at. The enemy is not that person who said something to anger you or to offend you or to hurt your feelings. Certainly there are issues there that need to be dealt with, but they're not your true enemy, because, again, Ephesians 6, we read, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And so I don't spend a lot of time talking about our enemy and talking about the demons in the spirit world, because I like to give glory to Jesus rather than give attention to the enemy. But sometimes we just need to be reminded that we have an enemy and that he comes in like a flood. Now, how does a flood come in? I was thinking about that. And a flood, for one thing, attempts to overwhelm us. I read a book called The Johnstown Flood that was very interesting, a historical account. And one of the things they said in that book, the eyewitnesses of this flood, said that when the waters came into Johnstown, that it was bringing all sorts of debris, not just debris like trees, but debris like things from a town, desks and houses. Everything you can imagine that might be in a town was coming, and it was in the front, like a wall in front of this flood. And I thought about that's what the devil does to us. He tries to bring a flood into our lives and bringing all kind of things with him. I found this. It says, when the enemy comes in like a flood, or when Satan, who's the common enemy of all mankind, when he comes in like a flood, he comes in threatening to carry all before him, introducing a flood of immorality and profaneness, just like the days of Noah and Lot. He threatens to come in and bring a generation and a society of immorality, a society of profanity, and I'm not just talking about cuss words, but a profane life. And certainly, without going into in much depth at all, certainly we can say that in the day we live, we see events and occurrences much like the days of Noah and Lot. We just recently saw our president profane the day, Resurrection Sunday, by declaring it a day of immorality. And that's not all. It's not just the president, and it's not just Congress, and it's not just the legislature, but it's all of culture and all of society allowing that flood to come in and to profane our minds, to cause us to embrace immorality as normal and natural. I am constantly blown away by the agreement with people, especially people who are in the church and people who name the name of Christ and yet embrace a false sense of truth and morality. I'm not going to go off on that. We'll leave that alone. But I just want to know, when the enemy comes in like a flood, that's not the end of the story. Because Isaiah continues and says, when the enemy comes in like a flood, and he will, and he does. As a matter of fact, I found this verse. Well, I didn't really find it. It was there all along. In Revelation 12, so the serpent spewed water out of his mouth. Who's the serpent? In the beginning of that chapter, it's very clear that the serpent is Satan. It's the devil. It's actually stated. When the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood, after the woman in this chapter represents God's people, the church, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So that we know the devil's after the church. We know the devil is after God's people. In some ways, he's got them. But he says the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him. The Spirit of the Lord will raise up a standard, and that standard in our world in New Testament times is Jesus Christ and his gospel. Jesus Christ, the standard lifted up in the ministry of the gospel. It's the gospel that brings people. It's the gospel that is the power of God unto salvation. And in that day, there shall be a root of Jesse, who shall stand as a banner to his people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. That day, Jesus is that banner. And reminding us of Psalm 91, if you dwell in the secret of the Most High, you shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. You shall not be afraid of the terror of the night, nor of the pestilence that walks in darkness. Know that when the enemy tries to come in like a flood, Jesus will be your banner. Jesus will be your standard, and he will drive him away. Don't live in fear, live in faith in Jesus Christ. You have a great day and a great week, and go out there and act like somebody.